It's disgraceful for Americans to fund rot news with tax dollars. Mr. President, the senator from Kentucky, from Louisiana. The United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in 1967. There was no internet, no Facebook, no Twitter, no cable TV, no podcasts. There were a handful of radio stations, and television was still new. Many Americans, especially in rural areas, lacked access to news. Congress funded public broadcasting to ensure everyone had access to news. The news was factually based and fair. Corporation for Public Broadcasting (CPB's) relationship to NPR and PBS. We give CPB about $500 million a year. CPB funds local TV and radio stations. They buy content from NPR and PBS. Since inception, $14.5 billion has been given, enough to build 2,700 miles of paved roads. Instead, we fund CPB, NPR, and PBS.
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky, from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with me today is my colleague from my office, Mr. John Lowry, and I appreciate his help. Last week, Mr. President, I spoke a few minutes about the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. We call it CPB. And the Public Broadcasting Service, most people know of that as PBS, and the National Public Radio, which most people know as NPR. And I'm not going to repeat everything I said last week, but I do want to revise and extend my remarks. The United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting back in the 60s, 1967, I think. Those were very different times. There was no internet. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. There was no cable TV. There were no podcasts. There were basically a handful, maybe a few more, of radio stations throughout America. And television was still pretty new. There were 3 main television stations with local affiliates. And many Americans, particularly in rural areas, didn't have access to radio and television for their news, because that's all there was. I remember those days. And so Congress decided to start providing money for what it called at that time public broadcasting, to make sure that everybody had access to news through radio and television, even if they didn't live in their big city. And Congress intended that news be news, factually based. Now, those were the days in America of true journalism. I remember them. Perhaps you do too, Mr. President. Those were not the days that we experience today, opinion journalism, where young journalists are taught to report on who, what, when, where, how, and their opinion. Those were days when the news was really the news, and it was fair and balanced. So the United States Congress created the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPS. CPS here 50 years later, 50 plus years later, or CPB rather, still exists. And here's its relationship, CPB's relationship to NPR and PBS. We give CPB, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, about $500 million a year. A lot of money. And Corporation for Public Broadcasting turns around and picks certain local television and radio stations and gives most of that money to them. And then those local television and radio stations, the chosen few that get money from the American taxpayer through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, buy programming and content from two other organizations. If they're a radio station, they buy it from NPR. And if they're a television station, they buy that content from PBS. So up here you've got Corporation for Public Broadcasting. American taxpayer through Congress gives them $500 million a year. That money flows down to certain select local television and radio stations. And those local television and radio stations then buy content from NPR, if they're a radio station, or PBS, if they're a TV station, which were loosely affiliated with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Since this scheme was established, the American taxpayer has given all of these entities about, $14.5 billion. $14.5 billion. That would be enough to build 2,700 miles of paved roads throughout America. And I base that on the roads I'm talking about are not gravel roads, they're regular paved roads, 10 feet each lane, actually 12 feet each lane with a 3-foot shoulder on each side. But instead of building 2,700 miles of roads in our rural areas and in our urban areas that need infrastructure, we've decided to give this money to CPB, which gives it to the local stations, which gives it to PBS and NPR. I mentioned the local stations. Only a select few local stations get this taxpayer money. Now, I probably wouldn't object to this if the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and National Public Radio is what I'm referring to, of course, and PBS had been consistent with its original mission, which is to report factually the news to the American people. Government doesn't need to subsidize the media anymore because the world's changed. 97% of the people in America have the internet. But I still probably wouldn't object that much if the reporting by these entities was fair and was balanced, but it is not. No fair-minded person in America can look at this programming and believe that it's unbiased. It is decidedly prejudiced in favor of one point of view.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, NPR, and PBS should report factual news. The government doesn't need to subsidize the media anymore. 97% of Americans have the internet, but the reporting is not fair and balanced. It is biased in favor of one point of view. Some last week, this is what Americans' taxpayer money is going to provide. Here's just some headlines from NPR. NPR loved Michael Avenatti, who of course is in jail today. He's a crook, but NPR loved him because he was anti-Republican and anti-President Trump. NPR published another article, How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music. Here's another headline from NPR, Donald Trump's long embrace of Vladimir Putin. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Eating less beef is a climate solution. How the Taliban adds to Afghanistan's woes when it comes to climate-fueled disasters. No fair-minded person would conclude that this is anything but bias toward certain points of view. But that's what NPR reported with your tax dollars. Here's more. Democracy on Trial, Part 1, a blueprint for the case against Trump. Is that fair and balanced? It's from PBS. They're obviously slanted to one point of view, and they're using taxpayer money.
That's not just my opinion. I think most Americans would agree with that. And because most Americans see the headlines that are produced by these three entities. I talked about some last week. This is what Americans' taxpayer money is going to do, to provide. Here's just some headlines from NPR. I mentioned these last week. I won't belabor them. Michael Avenatti, a profile of the media-savvy attorney. NPR, this is from NPR. They love Michael Avenatti, who, of course, is in jail today. He's a crook. But NPR loved him because he was anti-Republican and he was anti-President Trump. NPR published another article, How Racism Became a Marketing Tool for Country Music. Now, you don't have to be Euclid to see the implication here, that country music is racist, according to NPR. I don't think any fair-minded person would call that factual or fair and balanced. Here's another headline from NPR. Donald Trump's long embrace of Vladimir Putin. I also talked last week about a few other headlines from NPR. Here's one. Monuments and teams have changed names as America reckons with racism. Birds are next. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Eating less beef is a climate solution. Here's why that's hard for some American men. How the Taliban adds to Afghanistan's woes when it comes to climate-fueled disasters. No fair-minded person with an IQ above a single-cell organism would conclude that this is anything but biased to certain points of view. And there's more. I could do this all night, but I'm not. Here's some more headlines from NPR. There is no neutral. Nice white people can still be complicit in a racist society. That's what your tax dollars paid for. Another one. Ibram X. Kendi says no one is not racist. So what should we do? Another one. How artificial intelligence could perpetuate racism, sexism, and other biases in society. Another. Scientists debunk lab accident theory of pandemic emergence. Here's another one. As Trump pushes theory of virus origins, some see parallels to lead up to Iraq war. Your tax dollars at work. As U.S. confronts Russia, Trump's admiration of Putin is consistent. Another headline from NPR. The history of policing and race in the United States are deeply intertwined. Another. After Biden's debate performance, the presidential race is unchanged. This was the debate performance that President Biden gave, after which he got out of the race. If you believe that headline, you believe in the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes. But that's what NPR reported with your tax dollars. Here's more. Democracy on Trial, Part 1. A blueprint for the case against Trump. Is that fair and balanced? It's from PBS. Racism in the era of Trump, an oral history, another headline. January 13th, 2020. Another. This one's really special. A serial liar. How Sarah Palin ushered in the post-truth political era in which Trump has thrived. Now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and PBS have the right, whether I like it or not, or whether you like it or not, or whether Americans like it or not, to publish these articles and to broadcast this news. That's the First Amendment. But they don't have the right to do it with taxpayer money. At least half of America would look at these headlines and be offended. They would be offended first because they would, really for three reasons. Number one, they disagree with opinion journalism. Number two, they would disagree with the headline. And number three, they would disagree with the fact that these headlines are not fair. They're not objective. They're obviously slanted to one point of view. And they're using taxpayer money. If someone introduced a bill tomorrow, I'll just pick a publication to prohibit the New York Times, I would vote against that bill and argue against it. If someone introduced a bill to get rid of Fox News, I'd have the same position. If someone introduced a bill to get rid of the Washington Post, that would be my position as well. Whether I agree with those media outlets or not, we have a First Amendment, and we cherish it. And I'm rather fond of the Constitution.
Whether I agree with those media outlets or not, we have a First Amendment and we cherish it. But they can't do it on the taxpayer dime. President, the folks at PBS and NPR are doing pretty well for themselves. NPR just bought a $211 million office space near the Capitol. NPR pays its hosts up to $532,000 a year. Despite taxpayer money, their viewership has declined.
But if someone introduced a bill to give money to CNN, taxpayer money to CNN, or to the New York Times, or Fox News, I would oppose that as well. This is simply wrong. And we're spending $500 million a year, $14.5 billion over time, to give to people at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and NPR and NPS to participate in opinion journalism, which they're entitled to do. But they can't do it on the taxpayer dime. They're doing it on the taxpayer dime, but they shouldn't be able to. I would also point out, Mr. President, that the folks at PBS and NPR and PBS are doing pretty well for themselves. NPR just bought a $201 million office space just up the road from the Capitol. $200 million. It came from the American taxpayer, so they could publish this stuff. NPR pays its hosts as much as $532,000 a year, taxpayer money. It pays its chief diversity officer about $320,000 a year. And you know what? Despite all of this money that the American taxpayer are giving to these left-of-center entities, their viewership has declined because people don't need them anymore. So why are we giving them money? I've introduced legislation to not to eliminate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, not to eliminate the public broadcasting service, and not to eliminate the National Public Radio. They can go exist on their own if they want to, but I do want to defund them. We're running a $36 trillion in debt. This is disgraceful in 2025. It's disgraceful whether it is left of center opinion journalism or right of center opinion journalism. It is disgraceful for the American people to have to fund this rot. Doesn't mean the rot doesn't have a right to exist, but they don't have a right to taxpayer money.
I've introduced legislation not to eliminate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but to defund them. We're running a $36 trillion debt. It's disgraceful for taxpayers to fund this.